the star-feathered songbird. In the heart of the dense, ancient forest of Eldergrove, where the trees whispered secrets to the wind and the rivers sang lullabies to the stones, there lived a bird unlike any other. Its feathers shimmered like the night sky, each one a tiny constellation that glowed with an otherworldly light. The bird was known as the starling of Eldergrove, and its song was said to hold the power of prophecy. Those who heard its melodies would be granted visions of the future, but the knowledge came with a price that few were willing to pay. The starling's songs were not mere predictions. They were woven with the threads of fate itself. Each note carried the weight of destiny, and those who listened too closely would find their lives irrevocably changed. The villagers of Eldergrove spoke of the bird in hushed tones, warning their children to stay away from the forest's heart. They told tales of those who had sought the starling's wisdom, only to be consumed by the very futures they had tried to escape. But not everyone heeded the warnings. Among the villagers was a young musician named Elias, whose heart burned with a desire for fame and fortune. Elias had spent his life playing his lute in the taverns and market squares, his fingers dancing across the strings as he sang of love and loss, of heroes and villains. Yet, no matter how many songs he composed, no matter how many coins were tossed into his hat, Elias remained unknown, a mere shadow in the world of music. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to twinkle in the sky, Elias sat alone in the tavern, nursing a mug of ale. His lute lay beside him, silent and forgotten. He had played for hours, but the patrons had barely glanced in his direction. Frustration gnawed at his soul, and he longed for something, anything, that would set him apart from the countless other musicians who roamed the land. It was then that he overheard a conversation between two old men at the next table. They spoke in low, reverent tones of the starling of Eldergrove, of its shimmering feathers and its prophetic songs. Elias's heart quickened as he listened, his mind racing with possibilities. If he could capture the starling, if he could harness its power, he could become the most famous musician in the world. His songs would be more than mere entertainment. They would be glimpses into the future, sought after by kings and commoners alike. The next morning, Elias set out for the forest, his lute slung over his shoulder and a determined glint in his eye. The villagers watched him go, shaking their heads in pity. They knew the dangers that awaited him, but they also knew that nothing they could say would change his mind. Elias was a man driven by ambition, and ambition has a way of blinding even the wisest of souls. The forest was dark and silent, the trees towering above him like ancient sentinels. Elias pressed on, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no map, no guide, but he could feel the starling's presence, a faint hum in the air that grew stronger with each step. Hours passed, and the forest grew denser, the shadows deeper. Just as Elias began to doubt his quest, he heard it, a song soft and haunting that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The starling's song was unlike anything Elias had ever heard. It was a melody that seemed to transcend time itself, each note resonating with the echoes of the past and the whispers of the future. Elias followed the sound, his breath catching in his throat as he caught sight of the bird. It perched on a low branch, its feathers glowing with a light that seemed to pulse in time with the music. Elias's hands trembled as he reached for his lute, his mind racing with the possibilities. But as he drew closer, the starling's song changed. The melody grew darker, more ominous, and Elias felt a chill run down his spine. The bird's eyes met his, and in that moment, he saw something. A vision, fleeting but vivid, of a future that filled him with dread. He shook his head, trying to dispel the image, but it lingered, a shadow at the edge of his mind. Elias hesitated, his hand hovering over the starling. He knew the stories, knew the price that came with the bird's prophecies. But the lure of fame was too strong, the promise of a future where his name would be known across the land too tempting to resist. With a swift motion, he captured the starling, its song fading into silence as he placed it in a cage. As Elias made his way back to the village, the starling's feathers continued to shimmer, casting an eerie light on the forest floor. He could feel the weight of the bird's gaze on him, a silent reminder of the price he would have to pay. But Elias pushed the thought aside, his mind already racing with the songs he would compose, the fame that awaited him. Little did he know that the starling's prophecies were not gifts, but curses, and that the future it had shown him was one he would come to regret. The first prophecy. Elias returned to the village with the starling in its cage, the bird's feathers still shimmering with an otherworldly light. The villagers gathered around, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. They had heard the tales of the starling's power, and they knew that Elias had done something both extraordinary and dangerous. Elias, however, was too consumed by his own ambition to notice their unease. He set the cage on a table in the center of the tavern and began to play his lute, his fingers dancing across the strings as he sang a song of his own making. The starling remained silent, its eyes fixed on Elias with an intensity that made his skin crawl. But he ignored it, focusing instead on the crowd that had gathered to listen. As the last note of his song faded away, the starling began to sing. Its voice was soft at first, a whisper that seemed to come from the very air around them. But as the melody grew stronger, the tavern fell silent, the villagers holding their breath as they listened to the bird's prophecy. The starling's song spoke of a great storm that would sweep through the village, a tempest of wind and rain that would leave destruction in its wake. The villagers exchanged worried glances, but Elias only smiled. He saw the prophecy as an opportunity, a chance to prove the starling's power and cement his own fame. The next day, the storm arrived just as the starling had foretold. The wind howled through the streets, tearing roofs from houses and uprooting trees. The rain fell in torrents, turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud. The villagers huddled together in fear, their homes battered by the fury of the storm. But Elias was not afraid. He stood in the center of the village, his lute in hand, and sang a song of defiance. His voice rose above the storm, a beacon of hope in the chaos. The villagers watched in awe as the wind seemed to calm around him, the rain easing as if in response to his music. When the storm finally passed, the village was in ruins. But Elias was hailed as a hero, his name on the lips of every survivor. They spoke of his bravery, of the way his song had tamed the storm, and they spoke of the starling, its prophecy proven true. Elias basked in the adoration, his heart swelling with pride. He had done it. He had harnessed the starling's power and used it to achieve the fame he had always desired. But as he looked at the bird in its cage, he felt a flicker of unease. The starling's eyes were still fixed on him, its gaze piercing and unreadable. That night, as Elias lay in bed, he dreamed of the storm. But in his dream, the wind and rain were not the only forces at work. He saw shadows moving through the village, dark shapes that seemed to feed on the fear of the villagers. And he saw himself, standing in the center of it all, his song no longer a beacon of hope but a harbinger of doom. Elias woke with a start, his heart pounding in his chest. He told himself it was just a dream, a product of his overactive imagination. But as he looked at the starling, still perched in its cage, he couldn't shake the feeling that the bird's prophecy had come with a price he had yet to fully understand. The next morning, Elias returned to the tavern, his lute in hand. The villagers greeted him with cheers and applause, their faith in his power stronger than ever. But as he began to play, the starling remained silent. Its feathers no longer shimmered, its eyes dull and lifeless. Elias frowned, his fingers faltering on the strings. He had expected the bird to sing again, to reveal another prophecy that would further cement his fame. But the starling was silent, its song gone. As the days passed, Elias grew increasingly frustrated. He tried everything to coax the starling into singing again, but the bird remained stubbornly silent. The villagers began to whisper, their admiration turning to doubt. They had seen the power of the starling's prophecy, but without its song, Elias was just another musician. Desperate, Elias turned to the old men who had first told him of the starling. They listened to his tale with grave expressions, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear. "The starling's songs are not meant to be controlled," one of the old men said. "Its prophecies come with a price, and that price must be paid." Elias scoffed, his frustration boiling over. "What price? I captured the bird. I tamed the storm. What more could it want?" The old man shook his head. "The starling's prophecies are not gifts, Elias. They are warnings. And if you ignore those warnings, the consequences will be dire." Elias left the old man's house in a rage, his mind racing with thoughts of how to force the starling to sing again. He returned to the tavern, where the villagers were gathered, waiting for him to perform. But as he stepped onto the stage, he felt a chill run down his spine. The starling was no longer in its cage. Elias's heart skipped a beat as he scanned the room, his eyes searching for the bird. But it was gone, its cage empty. The villagers murmured in confusion, their eyes darting around the room. And then, from the shadows, the starling began to sing. Its voice was different this time, darker and more menacing. The melody was filled with discordant notes, each one sending a shiver down Elias's spine. The villagers covered their ears, their faces twisted in fear. Elias tried to play his lute, to drown out the starling's song, but his fingers trembled on the strings. The bird's prophecy was clear, its words echoing in his mind. "A shadow approaches, a darkness unseen. The price of your ambition will be your undoing." Elias's heart pounded in his chest as the starling's song faded into silence. The villagers stared at him, their eyes filled with fear and accusation. He tried to speak, to reassure them, but the words caught in his throat. The starling had sung its second prophecy, and Elias knew that the price of his ambition was only just beginning to be paid. The shadow approaches. The days that followed the starling's second prophecy were filled with tension and fear. The villagers of Eldergrove, once so eager to hear Elias's songs, now avoided him, their eyes filled with suspicion. The tavern, once a place of warmth and camaraderie, became a ghostly echo of its former self. The only sound that filled the air was the occasional whisper of the wind, carrying with it the faint, haunting melody of the starling's song. Elias tried to ignore the growing unease, to focus on his music and the fame he had so desperately sought. But the starling's prophecy lingered in his mind, a shadow that refused to be dispelled. He found himself waking in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his dreams filled with images of darkness and despair. The starling itself had vanished after its second song, leaving behind only an empty cage and a sense of foreboding. Elias searched the forest, hoping to find the bird and force it to sing again, but it was as if the starling had never existed. The only evidence of its presence was the lingering memory of its prophecies, and the growing sense that something terrible was about to happen. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to twinkle in the sky, Elias sat alone in the tavern, his lute resting silently in his lap. The villagers had long since gone home, leaving him to his thoughts. He stared into the flickering flame of a single candle, his mind racing with questions he could not answer. What had the starling meant by "a shadow approaches"? What darkness was coming, and how would it be his undoing? Elias's hands trembled as he gripped the neck of his lute, his fingers brushing against the strings but producing no sound. He felt as if he were standing on the edge of a precipice, waiting for the ground to crumble beneath his feet. As the hours passed, the tavern grew colder, the air thick with an unspoken dread. Elias's breath came in shallow gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the presence of something dark and malevolent, hovering just beyond the edge of his perception. It was as if the starling's prophecy had summoned a force that could not be seen, but could be felt in every fiber of his being. Suddenly, the candle flickered and went out, plunging the tavern into darkness. Elias's heart skipped a beat as he fumbled for another candle, his hands shaking so badly that he could barely light it. When the flame finally caught, he held it aloft, casting a feeble light that did little to dispel the shadows. And then he saw it. A figure stood in the corner of the tavern, its form shrouded in darkness. Elias's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the figure, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. The figure was tall and gaunt, its features obscured by a hooded cloak that seemed to absorb the light. But what chilled Elias to the bone was the sense of malevolence that radiated from the figure, a darkness so profound that it seemed to suck the very life from the air around it. Who are you?" Elias stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure did not respond. Instead, it stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. As it drew closer, Elias could see that its cloak was not black, but a deep, unnatural shade of purple that seemed to shift and writhe like living smoke. The figure's face remained hidden, but Elias could feel its gaze upon him, a gaze that seemed to pierce through his very soul. "You have summoned me," the figure said, its voice a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down Elias's spine. "You have sought the power of the starling, and in doing so, you have awakened forces beyond your comprehension." Elias's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the figure's words. I didn't mean to," he began, but the figure cut him off with a wave of its hand. "The starling's prophecies are not mere predictions," the figure continued. "They are warnings, and you have ignored them. Now the shadow approaches, and with it, the price of your ambition." Elias's heart pounded in his chest as he took a step back, his lute slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, as if considering the question. "I want nothing from you," it said. "I am but a messenger, a harbinger of the darkness that you have unleashed. The starling's song has set events in motion that cannot be undone. The shadow approaches, and it will consume you." Elias's mind reeled as he tried to process the figure's words. "What can I do?" he asked, desperation creeping into his voice. "How can I stop it?" The figure let out a low, mirthless laugh. "You cannot stop it," it said. "The shadow is a part of you, a reflection of your own ambition and greed. It is the price you must pay for seeking power beyond your reach." Elias's legs gave out, and he collapsed to his knees, his hands clutching at his head. "No," he whispered. "No, this can't be happening. There must be a way to stop it." The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. "There is no escape," it said. "The shadow will come, and it will take what is owed. But know this, the starling's final song has yet to be sung. When it is, you will understand the true cost of your ambition." With that, the figure turned and began to walk away, its form dissolving into the shadows as it went. Elias reached out as if to stop it, but his hand passed through empty air. The tavern was silent once more, the only sound the faint crackling of the candle flame. Elias sat there for what felt like hours, his mind a whirlwind of fear and regret. He had sought fame and fortune, but in doing so, he had unleashed a darkness that threatened to consume him. The starling's prophecies had been warnings, and he had ignored them, blinded by his own ambition. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows of the tavern, Elias made a decision. He would find the starling no matter the cost. He would force it to sing its final song, and he would face whatever fate awaited him. He could not undo what had been done, but he could confront the shadow that approached, and perhaps, in doing so, find a way to atone for his mistakes. With a heavy heart, Elias picked up his lute and stepped out into the cold morning air. The village was still asleep, the streets empty and silent, but Elias could feel the presence of the shadow, a darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of his vision. He knew that time was running out, and that the starling's final song would be his last chance to confront the consequences of his actions. As he made his way into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around him, their branches twisting and turning like the fingers of some ancient, malevolent being. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and somewhere, in the heart of the forest, the starling waited, its final song poised to reveal the ultimate price of Elias's ambition. The final song. The forest of Eldergrove had always been a place of mystery, but now it felt alive with a malevolent energy. The trees seemed to lean closer, their gnarled branches reaching out like claws. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the only sound was the crunch of Elias's boots on the forest floor. His heart pounded in his chest, each step taking him deeper into the heart of the darkness he had unleashed. Elias clutched his lute tightly, his fingers trembling as he navigated the twisted paths. He had no plan, no idea how to find the starling, but he knew he had to try. The figure in the tavern had spoken of the starling's final song, and Elias was certain that it held the key to his fate. Whether it would be his salvation or his doom, he could not say, but he knew he had to hear it. Hours passed, and the forest grew darker, the canopy above so thick that even the faint light of the stars was blotted out. Elias's breath came in ragged gasps, his body aching with exhaustion. But he pressed on, driven by a desperate need to confront the shadow that loomed over him. Finally, he heard it, a faint, haunting melody that seemed to come from all directions at once. The starling's song. Elias's heart leapt in his chest as he followed the sound, his steps quickening despite his weariness. The melody grew louder, more intense, and soon he found himself standing in a small clearing, the trees forming a natural amphitheater around him. In the center of the clearing, perched on a low branch, was the starling. Its feathers shimmered with a faint, ethereal light, and its eyes glowed with an otherworldly intensity. The bird's song filled the air, a melody that was both beautiful and terrifying, a symphony of hope and despair. Elias stepped forward, his lute in hand, and the starling's song shifted. The melody became darker, more ominous, and Elias felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that this was the final song, the prophecy that would reveal his fate. The starling's voice rose, each note resonating with the weight of destiny. The clearing seemed to pulse with the music, the trees swaying in time with the melody. And then the words came, clear and unmistakable. Beware the shadow, for it is near. The price of your ambition is one you must bear. The final note will sound, and all will be clear. But know this, musician, your end is here. Elias's heart stopped as the starling's song faded into silence. The clearing was still, the air heavy with the weight of the prophecy. He stared at the bird, his mind racing with fear and regret. The starling had sung his death, and there was no escaping it. But even as despair threatened to consume him, Elias felt a strange sense of calm. He had sought fame and fortune, but in doing so, he had unleashed a darkness that had consumed him. The starling's prophecies had been warnings, and he had ignored them, blinded by his own ambition. Now he would face the consequences. Elias raised his lute, his fingers trembling as they found the strings. He began to play, his music filling the clearing with a melody that was both mournful and defiant. The starling watched him, its eyes glowing with an intensity that seemed to pierce through his very soul. As Elias played, the shadows around the clearing began to shift and writhe, coalescing into a dark, malevolent form. The figure from the tavern emerged from the darkness, its cloak billowing like smoke. Its eyes glowed with a cold, merciless light, and its presence filled the clearing with a sense of dread. Elias's fingers faltered on the strings, but he forced himself to continue, his music a desperate attempt to hold back the darkness. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, and Elias knew that his time was running out. The starling began to sing again, its voice joining Elias's music in a haunting duet. The melody was filled with discordant notes, each one sending a shiver down Elias's spine. The figure paused, its head tilting as if listening to the song. And then, with a final, piercing note, the starling's song ended. The clearing fell silent, the air thick with the weight of the prophecy. The figure stepped forward, its hand reaching out towards Elias. Elias closed his eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that this was the end, the price he had to pay for his ambition. But even as the darkness closed in around him, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had sought fame and fortune, but in the end, he had found something far more valuable, the truth. The figure's hand touched his chest, and Elias felt a cold, numbing sensation spread through his body. His vision blurred, the world around him fading into darkness. And as the final note of the starling's song echoed in his mind, Elias knew that he had faced his fate with courage and acceptance. The clearing was silent once more, the starling's feathers no longer shimmering with light. The bird watched as the figure dissolved into the shadows, its task complete. The forest of Eldergrove was still, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. Elias's lute lay on the ground, its strings still vibrating with the echoes of his final song. The starling spread its wings and took to the sky, its song a faint, haunting melody that drifted through the trees. And somewhere, in the heart of the forest, the shadow that had consumed Elias began to fade, its darkness no longer needed. The starling's final song had been sung, and the price of ambition had been paid. The legacy of the starling. The village of Eldergrove was never the same after Elias's disappearance. The villagers spoke of him in hushed tones, their voices filled with a mixture of awe and fear. They had seen the power of the starling's prophecies, and they knew that Elias had paid the ultimate price for his ambition. The tavern, once a place of warmth and camaraderie, became a somber reminder of the dangers of seeking power beyond one's reach. The villagers avoided the forest, their fear of the starling and the darkness it had unleashed keeping them away. But the starling itself was never seen again. Some said it had flown to distant lands, its song a warning to those who would seek its power. Others believed it had returned to the heart of the forest, its melodies a haunting reminder of the price of ambition. Years passed, and the legend of the starling of Eldergrove grew. Travelers spoke of a bird with feathers that shimmered like stars, its song a melody that could predict the future. But they also spoke of the price that came with its prophecies, a price that few were willing to pay. In the village, Elias's lute was placed in a glass case in the tavern, a symbol of the dangers of ambition and the power of the starling's song. The villagers would gather around it, their voices low as they told the tale of the musician who had sought fame and fortune, only to be consumed by the darkness he had unleashed. And in the heart of the forest, the clearing where Elias had faced his fate remained untouched. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches forming a natural canopy that shielded the ground from the light of the sun. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the only sound was the faint rustling of the wind. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon was full and the stars were bright, the villagers would hear a faint, haunting melody drifting through the trees. It was a song that spoke of hope and despair, of love and loss, of heroes and villains. And they knew that the starling song was still out there, a reminder of the power of prophecy and the price of ambition. The legend of the starling of Eldergrove lived on, a cautionary tale for those who would seek power beyond their reach. And as the years passed, the villagers learned to live with the knowledge that some things were better left untouched, some songs better left unsung. But deep in the forest, the starling's song continued to echo, a melody that transcended time and space. And somewhere, in the heart of the darkness, the shadow that had consumed Elias waited, its presence a reminder of the price that had been paid. The starling's final song had been sung, but its legacy would live on, a haunting reminder of the power of prophecy and the consequences of ambition. And as long as the forest of Eldergrove stood, the starling's song would continue to drift through the trees, a melody that spoke of the past, the present, and the future. And so, the legend of the starling of Eldergrove endured, a tale of hope and despair, of love and loss, of heroes and villains. And as the villagers told the story to their children, they would always end with the same warning. Beware the starling's song, for its prophecies come with a price, and that price is one that few are willing to pay.